And so how this is gonna be as standard as we can make it. Tucker's gonna take half hour to 40 minutes to tell us what he has done. After that, we'll open it up for a few minutes for questions from the audience. Then we'll take questions from specific committee members. At that point, the committee will move into a different breakout group, which I have not done, though I think I know how to do it. And then we'll discuss.
We'll step out of the room. We'll step out of the room.
Yes. Yeah. We'll all step out of our rooms and somehow discuss. Though there is a breakout room function, which I'm going to try to use. So please bear with me as I have not done it. Then we'll reconvene after the committee discusses to inform Tucker of the committee's decision. So at this point, I'd also like to ask everyone to mute your computers or phones, except for obviously Tucker, because Tucker's going to take the next half hour or 40 minutes to tell us what he's spent the last couple of years doing here in New Mexico. So please, Tucker, take it away.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen with everybody. Let's see how this. Okay, can everyone see that? And I think you still see me too? Okay, so I can't hear anything from any of you anymore, so somebody say something if you can't. Okay, anyway, thanks for being here. I'm happy that this is going to work out. Not quite how I envisioned it happening, but it's nice that there's maybe more people than would normally have been able to attend in person. So thanks everyone for being here. Okay, so the title of my thesis is Drinking Water Governments for Whom? An Institutional Analysis of Rural Drinking Water Systems in New Mexico. Sorry, I'm moving some things around so I can see all everything. Okay, so, and then my academic committee is Ben Warner, Chris Duval, and John Fleck, so thanks to all of you. And I am in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies, but then this project is also part of UNM's Grand Challenges Initiative under the Sustainable Water Resources project. So what I wanted to do is look at drinking water systems in New Mexico, particularly because it seems like the state and NGOs have a pretty good idea of what the situation is along the major towns along the Rio Grande, but there's not a very good understanding of the situation of rural drinking water systems. So I wanted to dive deeper and learn from them to see what challenges they were facing and what the situation is for them. So across the US, there's lots of different studies looking at issues that water systems are facing. There's a bunch of examples here. But all of these studies seem to use either large data sets, either of violations or things like that, or they focus on the legislation around drinking water and just like the EPA and those kind of institutions, or they do small case studies on what particular smaller drinking water systems are doing. So what I wanted to do is actually go around to a number of rural drinking water systems around the state and see, hear directly from them what they're actually facing and what are issues for them, instead of getting the perspective from a larger state or national level. And New Mexico is a great place to do this because, as Allaire and others found in their research, there's more Safe Drinking Water Act violations in the southwestern US than the US as a whole. And then I also wanted to look at rural systems for a number of reasons, but including that they have been found to have more challenges in overcoming some hurdles based on their access to resources, their expertise, and capital. So I thought it'd be perfect to go around to these smaller communities and see directly from them how they're dealing with these challenges and what resources they have, and etc. So a little background on drinking water systems in New Mexico. There's 570 community drinking water systems across the state. And community drinking water system is defined as having at least 15 service connections or 25 people that live there year-round. And all systems are subjected to Safe Drinking Water Act regulation, which is national. And then in New Mexico, every drinking water system has to be organized as one of a number of different institutional structures. So these are things such as mutual domestic water consumers associations, water and sanitation districts, cooperatives, nonprofits, privately owned systems, or municipally owned systems. And I'm going to go pretty deep into these. And I'm going to focus on mutual domestic water consumers associations, which I'll just refer to as mutual domestics. Okay, so for my research questions, I asked, what are the needs and concerns of rural drinking water system managers across New Mexico, and how do they contribute to the vulnerability of drinking water systems? And then what are the circumstances that have influenced why a community chose a specific institutional structure for their drinking water system? And how does the institutional structure of a community drinking water system influence its ability to meet its goals? And so you can see that this is broken up into two parts. So I actually wrote my thesis as two separate research papers. So part one is titled The Creation of Vulnerability, and part two is titled Shifting of Power Dynamics Through Institutional Work. And I'll explain more what these mean. And there's also overlap between these two parts, but at the end, I'll kind of all wrap them together as well. Okay, so the methodology I use for this research is grounded theory, and I use mixed methods. So grounded theory is essentially, I entered the situation without having a theory of what the situation was for rural drinking water systems. I just started the interviews, asking questions and hearing directly from the people themselves, from the managers. And then using these interviews, I created a theory of what the situation is and what their needs and concerns are. And then I use subsequent interviews to test this theory and modify this theory. And then I use mixed methods, so I use quantitative and qualitative data, but I combine them and to draw on the strengths of each of those, qualitative and quantitative. And throughout this whole study, both my quantitative and qualitative methods were informing each other and what direction I was going to go and what was relevant. Okay, so what I actually did, we did 30 in-person interviews, myself and Amy Jones. So we drove around the state and talked to rural managers. It was usually the president of the water board, but sometimes it included the operators or bookkeepers. And these were all in all regions of the state. And so these interviews were recorded and transcribed. And then I coded the transcriptions into themes using the program in vivo. And so what this meant is that I had the transcripts and I would read through them and say if somebody was talking about regulations, I would highlight that and put it into a bucket. And then I was able to go into that bucket and see everything that everybody talked about as far as regulations, for example. I was also able to kind of compare that to different variables, such as the institutional structure. So this was a pretty great tool of analyzing this interview, this qualitative data, and drawing some pretty good conclusions from that to also see like, okay, everybody talked about this as an issue where only 2 water systems said that flood was an issue for them, for example. Okay, and then I also did an analysis of governing institutions and the institutional structures. So governing institutions meaning state agencies and then also nonprofits. And then I took a deep dive into the institutional structures, specifically mutual domestics. And then finally, I did a quantitative analysis using spatial data and demographic data from the US Census. Okay, so to start out with part 1 of my thesis. So to analyze this situation, I use the theoretical lens and framework of vulnerability. So vulnerability can be defined as the exposure and sensitivity to stresses and the system's ability to adapt. So exposure and sensitivity to stresses, you can think of this as like if a water system is in a heavily wooded area, they have a high exposure to wildfire, for example. And then their adaptive capacity is the ability of a water system to accommodate those new stresses. So how easily, if something does happen, like a wildfire, as an example in a community, how are they able to continue to provide the desired function of this system? So in this example, providing drinking water. And I'll talk a little bit more about this dynamic of vulnerability as we go through. But the vulnerability can think of like the higher the vulnerability is the increased exposure and sensitivity to stresses, or the decreased adaptive capacity of that system to accommodate these stresses. Okay, so what I found from these interviews, the main needs and concerns of rural drinking water system managers, and in a general order of what was most prevalent and what was the biggest concern. So not enough local people engaged in running the water system, deteriorating infrastructure, lack of funds and difficulty receiving outside funding, confusing and burdensome regulation, environmental concerns, including drought, wildfire, and contamination, and concerns of having enough water rights or losing their water rights. And I also wanted to include regionalization in this list because it's a little bit of a different thing, but I wanted to include it because a lot of managers of water systems cited regionalization as one of their biggest threats or their biggest concern. And I'll talk a lot more about regionalization later. Okay, but for now, I want to go back up to this very top issue. So not having local people engage in running the water system. So there's lots of reasons why this was an issue. And I thought this one was particularly interesting because it didn't come up a lot in some of these other studies that looked at issues that water systems were facing. And so there's a lot of reasons for this, including the responsibility of running a water system. Not like providing water to your community and not poisoning them is a lot of responsibility. And a lot of these systems, especially in particular mutual domestics and some other ones, the people who are managing them are volunteers. So they're tasked with all this responsibility. And then they're also essentially the bad guy when anything happens. If there's a water main break or the power goes out, and if people aren't getting their water, they're the person who has to deal with these situations. Or if somebody's not paying their water bill, they have to go to their neighbor's house and turn off their water. So there's all kinds of reasons, challenges. And then, but I think the main reason why this is a problem, not having enough people engaged in running the system, is because of all the other challenges going down this list. They're typically volunteers for most institutional structures, and they have to deal with the deteriorating infrastructure. They have to figure out how to find funds to replace their infrastructure. They have to keep up on regulation and submit it on time and to the right place, and be in compliance, meet those requirements. And then they have to think about if they have enough water rights or if they don't have enough water rights, etc. And then because they are spending so much time with some of these issues that are more like paperwork based or like bureaucracy, navigating the regulation, they're not spending as much time on environmental concerns like drought, wildfire, and contamination, because those are longer term problems. Those are like tomorrow problems, where submitting paperwork for some regulation is more today problems. So because they're faced with so many today problems, they're kind of neglecting these longer term problems. And so the thing is though that in this presentation and in generally all the managers, they weren't arguing against regulation. They understand that their water needs to be regulated and they need to have regulation over how they're spending their money, but just how they were enacted and the resources they have to comply with these regulations is more the problem. So because a lot of these issues such as regulation, the difficulty in finding funding, and the concerns of water rights, because those aren't inherent to running a water system, I kind of define those as created problems. And so I'll read a few quotes, and I think these kind of explain the situation relatively well. Okay, so you get a small board of normal Joe people. I don't know how they do it. I don't know how they keep track of the regulations and what they can do and what they can't do. I honestly don't know how they do it. I can't imagine they're in compliance. I don't know how they have the funds to do their own capital improvement projects. So I think this quote is interesting because one reason in particular is because this last sentence, if water systems are out of compliance, one way that the state enforces this is by making it more challenging to get funding. And they can also give water systems financial fines. But so it seems like a lot of the water systems who are not in compliance, they have more challenge getting funds, which it can be problematic in itself. But there's not really that many other ways that the state can enforce these regulations. Okay, so then another quote, I used to be about 70% outside, now I'm about 80% inside. So I'm doing a lot of paperwork, and that's not really what I like to do. I like to be outside. So that quote kind of speaks to this changing nature of running a water system is not actually about running the physical water system. It's about submitting paperwork and making sure you're in compliance and everything related to that. And then just a couple more. They could probably do the actual footwork of it and maintain actual water lines, but it's the paperwork that probably gets people. That's my feeling. So that kind of speaks to that last quote. And then this last quote, I'd like to hear less about what I'm doing wrong and how I can solve the problem, because that seems to be what the state is really good at. You're doing this wrong. Well, how can I solve it? Oh, I'm not allowed to tell you that. I can't give you the ideas on how to fix it, because if I tell you one thing, it sounds like I'm favoring something. And it's like, really just between us, you can tell me. I'm not gonna tell them, I just wanna fix this so you're not out here all the time. I'm not hearing from you every 2-3 months. So I think this quote is interesting because water systems want to be in compliance. They want to be compliant with regulation. So this manager in particular, they were managing the system essentially by themselves. They had kids, worked a full-time job, so they don't have the capacity to look into all these different options of how to fix their water system. They also don't have a lot of money because it's a very small system. So it's challenging to get an engineer to do an assessment, to even have money to do things like that. And I think this quote is also interesting because the role of the state government isn't to provide assistance, for the most part. It's generally to regulate. But because water systems, they interact with the state government much more regularly than nonprofits, which the role of nonprofits is to provide assistance. But because they interact with the state's telling them what they're doing wrong, they're looking to the state to tell them how to fix it too. And the state can't really tell them that, which is kind of another interesting issue and dynamic. Okay, so some conclusions from part one. These governing agencies are creating vulnerability for small drinking water systems. A lot of the issues, such as regulation, navigating bureaucracy, trying to find funding, they are constructed problems and they're not inherent to running a water system. And because managers are spending so much time on these constructed problems, they're not addressing like their watershed, doing like thinning operations or thinking about contamination from a gas station or septic tanks. They're so preoccupied with a lot of these day-to-day issues that that these are actually making water systems more vulnerable. And if everything's going well and water systems have the capacity to meet these regulations, they're absolutely a positive thing to have quality drinking water and to decrease financial fraud, etc. But because that systems don't necessarily have the capacity, they are neglecting other issues to meet these today issues. And so these are increasing water systems exposure to stresses, environmental and contamination stresses. And then also because there's so much regulation and it's making it so people don't want to deal with that, and they're volunteers, they don't have a very high adaptive capacity either, because there's generally a board and an operator and maybe a treasurer or a bookkeeper in these communities. But it seems like there's generally one person that does everything, and the other people kind of rubber stamp it or sign the checks. So there's not a lot of capacity for these systems to absorb some of these stresses based on their human capital at least. Okay, so now going into part two, and I'll kind of bring these together at the end. So shifting of power dynamics through institutional work. So just to restate the questions for this part of my thesis, what are the circumstances that have influenced why a community chose a specific institutional structure for their drinking water system? And how does that institutional structure of a community drinking water system influence its ability to meet its goals? Okay, so just some theoretical background for this part. So I'm viewing drinking water systems as a social ecological system. So there's the human, the users in this system, and then there's an ecosystem service, so water provided by the ecosystem. And then institutions are the rules and norms that dictate how these entities interact with each other. So how humans interact with each other, and then how humans interact with that ecosystem service of water. And then, like I said, institutions can be thought of as rules and norms, and they can be formal and informal, and they determine things like who holds decision-making power. And then I use the theoretical lens of institutional work to explain this situation, which I'll talk more about in a little bit. But institutional work is the actions of individuals and organizations aimed at creating, maintaining, and disrupting institutions. And kind of the main idea of this is that no action around an institution, it's impossible to not have an effect on that institution. Everything either creates, maintains, or disrupts this institution. And I'll talk more about how that applies to this situation in a moment. Okay, but first, in this chapter, I look at more of the institutions. So institutions can be thought of as governing institutions because they create the rules and norms, whether they're the regulating agencies or if they're non-governmental organizations. So on the left, you can see all these state agencies that water systems interact with on a regular basis. And then on the right, you can see some prominent non-governmental organizations. And so the role of the state agencies is to regulate, where the role of non-governmental organizations is to provide assistance. And that's their general role. Okay, but to focus on the state regulating agencies on this left side of this column, you can see there's 8 different agencies that water systems have to report to. So depending on the amount of people served, and especially depending on the institutional structure of a drinking water system, so whether it's a mutual domestic or a cooperative or a privately owned system, they have to report to a minimum of 7 and a maximum of 11 different reporting requirements to these different state agencies. So a lot of these state agencies have multiple reporting requirements for different systems. So, and the thing that's interesting is that mutual domestics, they are some of the smaller systems, but they have the same regulatory burden as larger municipalities. And so I'm going to focus on mutual domestics because of that dynamic, and also because of going through the interviews, they seem to be the water systems that were in the worst shape out of all of the water systems with different institutional structures. Okay, so mutual domestics, they were created by a legislative statute in 1947, and the purpose of them was to give state resources to rural and poor communities to improve their drinking water infrastructure in an effort to improve public health. And so they've been around for a very long time. But they've been updated quite a few times with multiple Sanitary Projects Acts. However, the overall framework, the idea of mutual domestics has not really changed that much. They still are managed by volunteers and have a board, and still the overall structure is quite the same today. And they are technically subdivisions of the state government. And because of that, they are eligible for a lot more state resources than, say, a cooperative or a privately owned drinking water system is. And like I said, they're managed by volunteers, so they have a volunteer board. However, some of them do pay, I guess all of them pay an operator, and then they generally have a bookkeeper or an accountant or something like that. And because they are subjected to all these burdensome and confusing regulations, as far as for the resources that they are kind of starting to fail. And I'll talk more about that, what that looks like. What does failure mean for a rural drinking water system? Okay, so some interesting quotes about mutual domestics I'm gonna read really quick. Probably the state would like us to all be mutual domestic, but one of my mutual domestic friends say, you don't want to become a mutual domestic. Too much paperwork, too much regulatory compliance before you can do anything. Like the contractor we worked with, he said he did some work for the mutual domestic in another town. He said, we can't do anything until everybody signed off on 5 different levels. Another person said, it takes a thinking person to really manage these nonprofits, these mutual domestics. It really does. There's a lot of things that don't make sense. As you start going and you start learning more and more about mutual domestics, it's always a contradiction sometimes, which I think is a pretty funny quote in itself. Okay, so these kind of just speak to the nature of mutual domestics and the difficulty in navigating regulatory and bureaucracy. So to explain how this situation has come about, I use the theoretical framework of institutional work. So mutual domestics have been around for a very long time, like I stated, and they have not changed that much as far as like the actual statute that creates them. So like the actual like legislation, the legal structure of mutual domestics. However, I argue that the actual institution as a whole of mutual domestics has drastically changed. And the reason that has happened is because of these tangential institutional changes. So increased regulation in particular, although it didn't change the formal structure of the mutual domestics, it has had a large impact on them because the structure of mutual domestics with their volunteer board has remained the same, but now they have increasingly through time been subjected to more and more regulatory burden that they're kind of struggling to keep up with that because their institutional structure, their formal institutional structure hasn't been on like a parallel path of giving them more resources in order to meet those regulations. So everything that has happened around mutual domestic does change it, whereas the actual legal framework has not changed. And then also thinking about the reinforcing institutional work that has happened around mutual domestics. So like I said, 37% of the water systems in New Mexico are mutual domestics. So every time another water system is added as a mutual domestic, or every time a compliance officer is hired by the state to regulate mutual domestics, or every time a training session is held to train managers of mutual domestics. These actions are all strengthening this institution of mutual domestics. And although some of them might be considered positive, it is still making institutional mutual domestics a stronger institution. It's giving them kind of a sort of institutional momentum. So in order to significantly change mutual domestics, it would take a greater amount of disrupting institutional work. Okay, so there's also like a power dynamics relationship with this as well. So governing agencies, they have power over small and rural drinking water systems. They are able to decide what's important, what's not important, what they need to regulate, and what's giving and what abilities water systems have. So the state and governing entities have decided that drinking water issue and financial fraud are large issues. So they decided that those are big issues for a water system. Whereas managers that I talked with, they don't argue that those aren't issues, but they're not as big of issues as the issues that were created by the creation of those regulations. So actually, like having good water quality and not stealing from their water system might not be the issues, but complying with those has created this whole other set of issues. And then also by enacting this regulation, water systems are then subject to more state control, and the state government has more more of a say in the happenings of rural communities. And a lot of times rural communities, the only really like government entity they have is a drinking water system. So by the state government having more of their hand in the happenings of their water system, they're just overall having more of a say in that system, or in that community dynamics in general. And then the state has a lot of power, and then because they have this power, they're kind of creating the situation for some water systems to fail. And the thing I want to say too is that it's not that the state is doing a bad job or they're like trying to make systems fail. It's an institutional failure. It's because these regulations have been passed without giving water systems more resources and things like that. It's not that the state is trying to make water systems fail. Everybody wants water systems to succeed, and I think everybody working at the state is trying to doing a good job. So it's not. So I'm not blaming the state in any way here. Okay, so what the state is doing though, the state government, and then along with nonprofits, particularly RCAC, Rural Community Assistance Corporation, they are promoting the idea of regionalization, which also has a power dynamic to it because the state sees that the state understands this dynamic. And so they're trying to help rural water systems by promoting regionalization. And so by doing that though, they're also kind of like exerting their power to try to persuade communities to join regional water systems. And I guess I should define regionalization first, but so regionalization could mean water systems actually connecting their systems so they share water, but it also can mean sharing an operator or sharing parts or sharing labor if somebody needs some help patching a water line or something like that. So it seems that kind of like the foundation of this issue is, so if the government wants to enact drinking water regulation, they don't want to just say this drinking water regulation is only for large municipalities because that's an environmental justice issue. You can't have higher quality water for a larger city and lower quality water for a rural community. But to meet this regulation, the system has to have that capacity to satisfy that. And a lot of these small communities don't necessarily have that capacity. So the government is promoting regionalization as a way to increase this technical, managerial, and financial capital or capacity by consolidating resources from rural water systems and achieving economies of scale. So that's kind of the goal of this regionalization. But I think that there's kind of this, they're not thinking about what water means to communities because there's a lot more than just like the material aspect of water. Water means it has an identity, it gives communities identity. There's a lot of importance for having local control of water in so many communities, not just in New Mexico, but everywhere. So a lot of communities view regionalization as an attempt to take away their water and take away their control. So there's a power dynamic in that. And then the one last thing I want to say is that communities are already regionalizing because they're in a situation where they're somewhat struggling. They are depending on their neighbor, the manager of another water system. If something breaks, they're calling up another manager to help them with that. They're using each other for knowledge to learn about how to run a water system. They're sharing parts with each other. So water systems are already informally regionalized. And there's some that are regionalized already. And there's some of them are doing very well. And regionalization can be a very useful tool, but I don't think it shouldn't be a blanket policy because there's lots of other aspects at play there. Okay, so now kind of looking at the problematic nature of mutual domestics in particular, because of the issues that I've discussed and how mutual domestics seem to be struggling more than the institutional structures of other water systems with other institutional structures, I wanted to look at Okay, so who are the people that are being served by mutual domestic water systems? Where are these water systems, and who is being affected by these this problematic institution? So here I created a map of every drinking water system in New Mexico, which is represented by each of these dots. The size of the dot represents the population served by that water system. And then the color of the dot represents the institutional structure of that water system. So you can see there's quite a few different institutional structures, but the one I want to focus on is the blue dots, so the mutual domestics. Okay, so I wanted to see, to figure out who these water systems are serving. I figured out the percentage of water systems in each county that are mutual domestics. And so the state average is 37%. So you can see in this map, the counties that are darker red, they have higher than average percent of the water systems in that county are mutual domestics, whereas the lighter colors are lower than average. So it appears that the water systems, the mutual domestic water systems, are clustered. And to see if this was the case, I used Moran's eye autocorrelation clustering test, which you can see on the result on the right side of this screen. And so for that test, I did it for the county level and the block group level. And so you can see my p-values. But the only thing I want to really take away from this is that communities are not randomly choosing their institutional structure. So there is some significance in the communities that are mutual domestics. It's not just random which communities these water systems are serving. Okay, so first I wanted to look at the population served by each of these 6 institutional structures that I identified as most common and in rural areas. So you can see mutual domestics on the left. And so this map is the median population served. So you can see that mutual domestics serve amongst the lowest populations for the communities that they serve, where mutual domestics and water and sanitation districts, they serve a higher number of people. And then I also look at the median household income for each institutional structure. So you can see that mutual domestics are among the lowest median household income as well. So these results are they're not surprising, because the mutual domestics were originally created in the 40s to help communities that are the smallest communities and lower income communities. And that's still true to this day. They are still serving the smallest communities and the lowest income communities. So if we look at the household income on this map, you can see where these are just the household incomes for each water system. So you can see where the areas of the lowest median household income are. And then if we compare that to that same map, the very first one of mutual domestics, you can see that there's quite a bit of translation of mutual domestics. So the blue dots in this picture, or in this one, in this map, and then the lightest yellow dots in this map. So just going back and forth a few times, you can see it's pretty prominent translation there. And then just to dive a little bit further into who lives in these communities that mutual domestic water systems are serving, I also look at some race demographics. So particularly the percent Hispanic population. So here's a map of the percent of people in those communities, or the block groups of the communities that water systems are serving. What percent of those people are of Hispanic origin? So you can see that in this map, the darker circles with higher percent Hispanic population seems to translate also onto the areas that the water systems that are mutual domestic. So I'm going back and forth a few times. It's kind of interesting, just that translation between those two colors, and then adding in the median household income onto that as well. It's a pretty noticeable translation in those populations. So then if we look at an actual graph of that same data, the median percent Hispanic population of the communities that the water systems serve, you can see that mutual domestics, they do have a higher percentage of Hispanic population. So I think the thing that's interesting about this is that for all the reasons I've identified as the reasons why mutual domestics are problematic, they're also serving the lowest income, the smallest rural communities that are also serving predominantly Hispanic communities. And so they're not only, it's not just a problematic institution, it's also racially discriminatory as well. So because mutual domestics, they have all this higher regulatory burden, or at least more for the size of their water system. Well, the reason why they have that is because they're subdivisions of the state government, and because they're eligible for more state funding. So theoretically, being more eligible for state funding should mean that that translates to more affordable water for those communities. But looking at this data of the monthly water rates, median monthly water rates for communities with different institutional structures, you can see the left column that the median monthly water bill for communities with mutual domestics is amongst the highest out of all the institutional structures. So it seems that this trade-off of having more regulatory burden is not translating to more affordable water for these communities. And then if I normalize this data with household income, you can see mutual domestics on the left. Because they're the lowest income communities, they are paying a much higher percent of their median household income for their water bill. So I think that's quite problematic. Okay, so my conclusion for part 2. So the ability to overcome these challenges that I laid out in part 1 is somewhat by the institutional structure of that water system. And then particularly mutual domestics are problematic because of the increased issues that I talked about in part 1, and then also because they are mostly in lower income and predominantly Hispanic communities. And it's not translating to lower costs for water consumers, so the benefit isn't really there. And it is not only a negative institution, it's also strong due to all of this reinforcing institutional work. And it's also a negative and a racially discriminatory institution as well. So kind of my final thoughts is, and kind of going back to the title of my thesis is Water Governance for Whom? I want to ask just like, who is water governance for? Because it seems that for all the reasons I stated, that the state agency, instead of for the state agencies serving for the existence and success of rural or just drinking water systems in general, it seems that drinking water systems appear to be serving for the existence of state agencies because they're spending more time, instead of addressing their concerns of actually managing their system, they're spending more effort on supporting this, the bureaucracy of the state, it seems like. And they're not really getting a lot back from that, it appears. Yes, it's important to have the good water quality and money being spent well, but it seems to be happening in a way that's not necessarily beneficial for the water system. And then I also want to think about, because some water systems are starting to fail, what does that mean? So a lot of systems we talked to in our interviews, it seems like we did select for water systems that are doing relatively well because they're willing to spend time talking to university researchers about their water systems. So, and even a lot of the ones we talked to are not doing very well. They're borderline starting to fail. So, but what does failing mean? Because it seems like failing can mean that they're going to not provide water in a way that they're meeting all the they're complying with regulations, but it doesn't seem that water systems are going to stop serving water to their community completely. They're going to keep providing water to their community because it is such an important resource, having water for a community. And the people who are running these systems are so dedicated already because they're the ones who are navigating this situation already, that even if they're not in compliance anymore, they're going to continue to provide water because it is such an important community asset. So it's just interesting to think of what failure means when thinking about all of these issues and what they mean for the future of drinking water in New Mexico. So that's all I have. Thanks, everybody. And thanks to all my committee members, and then also our Climate and Human Development Research Group. So Amy Jones, Rachel Sanchez, and Anthony Maluso. And Amy and Rachel helped with interviews, so big thanks to them. And then the UNM Grand Challenge Initiative, which provided funding for this research. And then thanks to the Geography Department for the staff and the faculty and all the other graduate students. I couldn't have done this without you all. You're all amazing. And I'm so lucky to be in such a great department. And then thanks to all my friends and family for helping me along the way. So thanks, everybody.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Tucker. I'm sure you're getting a round of applause out there. Absolutely. So at this point, why don't we open it up to questions from the audience before we open it up to questions from the committee. So if you have a question, unmute your microphone and please just ask Tucker directly.
Okay, don't all ask at once.
Hey, Tucker, this is Anthony. I got a question for you.
Yeah.
Hey, awesome presentation. Really appreciate the work that you're doing, and I think it has a potential to be really helpful to state agencies. As I work for one, a lot of this resonates with me. About your interviews with folks, one of the things that I've seen be a concern for people is the level of uncertainty in applying for water rights or in doing processes with the state. Is that something that came up in your interviews? And do you think that thinking about these mutual domestics as maybe as an investment and like a community investment, and how to lower uncertainties and risks for communities that seem to come up because of the like constructed problem of the paperwork? Does that, yeah, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, well, with water rights, I was kind of surprised how people didn't really talk that much about water rights. And it seemed like it came up most often due to regionalization, where communities thought that regionalization was just a mechanism to kind of like take their water rights from their communities and give it to another community, or at least share, so they wouldn't have as much water for their own community. But I think the thing that was interesting too is the process of creating a new mutual domestics from individual wells. So, because the idea is that you can pool water rights from individual wells into a mutual domestic, and so I guess it's somewhat of a creation of like new water rights. But it seemed that there's so much challenges of making new mutual domestics that is like a really big challenge for that. And I think the idea is to like what you're saying, to decrease these, like, I don't know, if you can consolidate all these individual wells into one, you can kind of increase the people who are working on that, etc. But it seems that the state doesn't want to create any more mutual domestics, which I think is a good thing, because they understand that it is a little bit problematic, and they're trying to promote regionalization. So instead of being able to create, or in order to create a new mutual domestics, you have to prove that you're a sufficient distance away from an existing water system and you're not able to connect with that. There's a lot of hoops to jump through. So yeah, but I think the one other thing with water rights, which is interesting, is that the idea of beneficial use. I didn't really talk about this much, but because people want to keep their water rights, they don't want to lose them, so they want to prove beneficial use, but they also don't want to deplete their water source, like their well. But it seems like a lot of communities are promoting things like gardens just so people will use more water, so that they can say like, oh, we're using this amount of water, so the state won't like take some of their water rights, which I don't believe the state ever has, but they view that as a threat.
Yeah,
So,
we haven't, but we threaten to all the time.
yeah, communities understand that threat for sure. But I think it is a little bit troubling that communities are choosing to use more water just to prove beneficial use instead of conserving it. So that's a little problematic, I think.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
I don't have a question, Tucker, but I just wanted to say that I was really impressed with the depth of your research, your very articulate presentation. You made this information interesting to someone that this is not my area at all in terms of this kind of jurisdictional as well as institutional kind of framework of thinking about water. And your visualizations, your maps, and the way that you showed that you had a passionate analysis, that it was something kind of that you personally dug in and were thinking about what it was the maps were begging questions for you to pursue further. So I just wanted to say that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Tucker. This is Heather. Excellent presentation. You did a really good job. I have a question that really doesn't have quite to do with your exact research, but maybe thinking beyond your research to the times we're in right now. So one of the things that we have to think about with water utilities is how resilient they are to major stressors. And so we're facing this major stressor right now with the coronavirus. And thinking about the research that you've done with these water utilities, do you have any thoughts about how they're going to withstand what's going on? They are at the point where maybe there's one person running the utility, or maybe two. What if that person gets sick, or how do they help each other during this really crucial time where we're facing this pandemic? So I thought, my question is more just maybe interpreting your research a little bit to what do you think might be facing water utilities, right now in this pandemic?
Yeah, that's a good question. I really hadn't thought about it that much in this pandemic. And I think the point that you brought up, that a lot of these systems, they are managed by one person. So there's like this joke that a lot of people said going around, that they're going to be the manager until they die because nobody else wants it. So every time somebody becomes a manager, it seems like, and if they do, they might be a manager and the person who does everything for, I don't know, 30 or 40 years. And then if they do at least maybe retire, might not necessarily have to die to stop managing it. But it does, there's so much institutional knowledge that's lost. But I think that the thing that I also found that was interesting is that we asked all the managers, like, why you do it, like, why are you the person that is managing the water system? And everybody said, well, not everybody, there's people have various reasons, but a lot of people said because nobody else would do it. And so I think that was an interesting answer, because it seems like in these communities, somebody will step up just because of how important it is. So everybody said nobody else would do it. And some of them had good answers, like why they were the best ones to step up to the plate. But it seems like, yeah, but somebody will. I think somebody will do it, just how important it is. So I don't know, it's an interesting thing to think about right now, because a lot of these people are, a lot of them are in their 80s, who are the ones like digging holes and fixing leaks and everything. So I don't know. That's a good point. So this is definitely kind of a new stressor that I imagine nobody really anticipated having to deal with is for anything, including water systems. So yeah, don't really know if that answered your question, but
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and if you think about the fact that they are older, and that is very true from our work, we find the very same thing, that it's generally older individuals who, do this work. And usually when we're training operators, there's hardly anybody in the room under about 60.
yeah,
And in this particular case, those are also the most vulnerable people who should be sheltered at home, and they can't be because they have to be on the front line. So I think it's, if we haven't carefully thought through this before, which I really don't think we have, especially not in New Mexico, it is something that we definitely need to be thinking about in the future. How are we going to handle this kind of thing? So I think your research is a really good stepping off point for that kind of thing in the future. So I applaud you for what you've done, and I hope that we can, as an entire state-wide set of folks who do assistance and regulation and everything else, maybe take what you've done and run with it a little bit, to kind of see what can we do to help in the future in this kind of thing, because this probably isn't the last pandemic we're going to face.
yeah.
So we definitely should look at that. And again, thank you. I thought that was an excellent presentation.
Thanks. Yeah, and thanks for bringing up that topic of the current situation outside of just the presentation method. So how it relates to the topic. So yeah, it's interesting to think about.
Well, I think that's a great question to now transition from audience questions to committee member questions, just to stay on schedule. So could I ask John, if you have questions, comments for Tucker, please go ahead and ask.
First of all, Tucker, this is terrific. Can folks hear me? Yeah, this is terrific, and I think it's helping a lot of us. Your work is helping a lot of us understand an issue that we hadn't thought well about, because as you said at the beginning, we're all thinking about big cities on the Rio Grande. So thanks so much for doing this work. I have a question about your discussion extensively in the paper, and then you touched on it briefly at the end of your presentation about risk of failure, and in particular the sort of two different definitions of failure that you've offered and the comparison between the two, the regulatory failure, the failure to meet the regulations and rules the state is imposing, versus the failure to actually deliver water to my tap. And I'm wondering if in your work you've seen or know how to get or know how to think about data that would compare those two, either across your sample or across the sort of broader population of water systems in the state. So we know like how many in each category we have and what are the overlaps in those categories.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think maybe just off the top of my head, just one way to kind of assess that would be to look at different violations. So yeah, because a lot of systems, they have violations for numerous things. And so I think maybe one thing that would be very telling is how many of the violations are because of not submitting like paperwork on time, compared to actually failing an actual standard. So that would actually tell us like maybe how many times the water is actually of lower quality versus the percentage of violations that are just people not submitting things on time. So maybe that could give us some metric.
And then do we have is data available on how many times these systems like literally don't deliver water at all? In other words, fail to deliver water of any quality, like the taps run dry.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I don't know if that's because there's all kinds of regulation of like, yeah, I imagine just thinking about like, is there an actual regulation of like, you are required to provide water? Because that just seems so basic, but I don't know. I guess they're required to have a certain amount of pressure in their system, so that would be a violation if you don't have water. So yeah, so I imagine that might exist. Or another thing would be boil water notices, because that's a very like serious acute violation. So that would be essentially like, I don't know, I mean, you're still providing water, but it's not potable. So that would be that might be a good metric too.
Yeah.
So, and there is the same data that I got a bunch of my data from, the same database is the Drinking Water Watch database, and they have all violations of every water system in the state going back to, I don't know, I think the 70s or something. So there's a lot of data there. But I'm not a big data person, so I didn't really dive into that world that much. Yeah, but that would be really interesting to see, kind of comparing those two definitions of failure. Yeah, hopefully that kind of answered your question.
Yeah, that was good. That's helpful. Thanks.
Did you have additional questions, John, or do you?
Yeah, just briefly, and I know this is something, Tucker, you and I have talked about a little bit in some of our meetings, but if you could maybe elaborate for the broader audience, why we don't have explicitly Native American communities as part of your sample.
Oh yeah, yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, I did not go on any tribal land because they are not really governed by the New Mexico Environment Department. So they're not really in the same regulatory framework, same environment. And also because doing research, we had to go through the institutional review board to get approval to do research on human subjects by doing interviews, where each tribe, each pueblo, they have their own IRB. So you have to get explicit permission to go onto each one of those tribal land. So yeah, so this excluded all tribal land in this study.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. Good clarification.
All right, Chris, do you have any questions for Tucker?
Great. Hey, Tucker, great job. I know the situation has been a challenge over the last couple of days, just trying to figure out how to do this. So I'm glad that it's working, and it seems to be going pretty well. I just have a couple of questions. John's question about tribal land was one that I had as well. Okay, so one kind of methodological question, just thinking about your maps and your graphs.
Mm-hmm.
Do the water authorities, both the mutual ones and the other kind of categories you have, do they have boundaries that are defined by county lines or by census lines or by a variety of things? Because your graphs are based on census data and your maps are based on county data.
Yeah, so I used different scales depending on what I thought made the most sense for that. So this one, where are we? This is the only one I used county data just because I thought it was a better visualization. But all of these graphs, these are either based on just the water system data or the block group that, well, I guess so. To make these points, I got the latitude, longitude coordinates of every single piece of water infrastructure, drinking water infrastructure in the state, which was a database of 7,000 different points. And then I created a mean center from all of those points to draw just one point for a water system. So a lot of these water systems, like Albuquerque, for example, is only one point on this map, but it obviously goes over many different block groups. So it's representing the block groups that's in the center of that water system, which for a lot of communities, there is only one block group. But other ones for larger, I don't think it's as good of a metric for larger communities. Just thinking about that mean center of all the points. And then just what block group that point fell in is what data I used. Yeah, so that was the best way I could think about going about that, though, because there is no other way of finding that data, because there's no, just because they do go across even municipality borders and all kinds of things there. They just kind of are their own spatial thing.
And how do these water authorities, do they have they don't really have boundaries, do they? They're just kind of bounded by the service points and the infrastructure points. I mean, it's not that they have authority over space, it's just over infrastructure, I guess. Is that accurate?
Yeah, they have, and some of them have power of eminent domain. I think like water sanitation districts do and stuff. And then some of them, oddly, they like also just happen to own like the community center because they're the only like government entity in that town, which is kind of interesting. But the thing about water systems too is that a lot of times water systems seems like they used to be two systems, or sorry, they used to be one system, but then there was like disagreement, so somebody put a valve and made it into two systems. So there's literally one system on one side of the street and another system on the other side of the street. And sometimes the pipes are like on top of each other. And sometimes there's lots of communities where the end of one system came up and there was like a fire hydrant, and then the end of the other system was like 4 feet apart. So, and it's both in the same community. So it's yeah. So there's a lot of local politics
sort of
involved in that. Sorry, what was that?
Designed by committee, it sounds like. Designed by committee.
Yeah.
And so I guess two other questions here. One of them, I'm looking at your figure 9 in your thesis. It's the median population served for each institutional structure. I don't know if you had that. Yeah, that one there.
Yeah, this one.
I'm just wondering about economy of scale here, like that compared to, like your figure 7, most of the other figures, I guess, figure 7, figure 8, looking at cost things. How much of the cost problem with the mutual districts is simply because they're serving so few people? I mean, the municipal districts serve a lot more people. Are we just looking at the effects of, economies of scale to a certain extent? I mean, there's variations and differences with the other different institutional structures there, but how much of that is going on?
Yeah, I think there is something there, absolutely, because I think, what is this, the cost of, I think this one, like, it's lowest for mutual domestic, or for municipal systems, and those are the largest. But I think the telling thing kind of is that compared to mutual domestics and then the other ones that are just as small, so like cooperatives, nonprofits, and investor owned, they're all the same size. And so they seem to, at least other than cooperatives, the nonprofits and the investor owned, they do have lower water bills. And I think another thing I should note is that cooperatives seem to be much wealthier communities too. So I think that those ones, like in particular, were more wealthy. So I think there is something there, the concept of economies of scale, but I think that there's also something that's kind of, I don't know why then cooperatives, nonprofits, and investor owned, or I guess particularly nonprofits and investor owned, wouldn't also have as high of water bills too. So yeah, and even those cooperatives, nonprofits,
and it seems to me like, economies of scale can help us. Sorry, it seems to me like the economy of scale to a certain extent can help understand why the regulatory burden is so high on the mutuals, simply because they don't have the people or the training to manage and deal with the regulatory burden there. And the last question I have is, if I'm understanding everything correctly, what you're arguing is that these mutual authorities have become biased, right?
Yes.
And I'm just wondering whether, how can have become biased versus they started biased? Because if they were, began in the 40s in places that were not served adequately at that point in time, those were already places that were marginalized, socially and economically, culturally in many cases as well. Like, again, so how do you know that it's become biased and didn't just start that way?
I guess I think they always did start it that way, at least the population that they're serving. So I think they've always been serving like majority Hispanic communities and smaller communities. But I think what flipped though was and assuming it was positive when it started out, it was actually helping these communities. So if we create some kind of institution that's actually helping marginalized communities, then I think we can consider it as like a very positive thing that's helping those communities. But I think what has changed is, instead of the communities changing, I think it's just it's become a negative institution instead of a positive institution. So instead of trying to help these communities in particular, now it's harming these communities in particular. So I think that's more what's changed, instead of the communities that they're targeting.
Okay, cool. I'll go ahead and pass it to you, Ben, to keep it moving.
Awesome, thank you. So at this point, I think we're on schedule. I am going to create a breakout room for John, Chris, and myself for the committee discussion. And then we'll take a few minutes, discuss in our breakout room, and then we'll join the larger group. For those of you in the audience, you're welcome to hang around. You can also drop off whenever you need to. If you do drop off, I'd like to thank you for joining us and for joining us in hearing all about Tucker's defense. Right.
And can I just really quickly thank everybody who came? I'm kind of feeling isolated here, and it was kind of fun to have a group of people together. So thank you all.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I really appreciate you all coming to be here, and thanks for the questions. And yeah, we really appreciate you all taking the time.
Yeah, I'll second.
Thanks for inviting us, and good luck. I will sign off, but I appreciate you doing that, and good luck.
Thank you.
I am moving us now. This is my first time doing this, so. Still there.
Tucker, I got a question for you while we're hanging out.
Sure.
Did you look at any correlation between communities that already had an acequia system
Yeah.
and the type of system that they're served by for their drinking water supply?
Yeah. I guess anecdotally, I think it appears, yeah, we didn't specifically ask about acequias, but it seemed like the communities that had acequias were usually mutual domestics, because mutual domestics, it seems like, are older communities too. Communities have been around for a long time. But I think the thing that acequia communities, more notably, they seem to be much more adamantly against regionalization than other communities. And I think that's just how they view water as like importance of local control, similar to how they view acequias as like part of, or like what role water has in their community. So I think that was translated to drinking water as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then regionalization was seen as more of a threat to take away that local control of their water. So that was a significant finding, I think. But we didn't really ask about that, so I don't really know. Yeah, it would have been, it's a follow-up thing that I think would be really interesting.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, just looking from the maps as I was thinking about it, it appears to be that mutual domestics match up where acequias are or have been.
Yeah, and I didn't really do analysis of where mutual domestics were, like, I mean, where the significant clusters were, like the location of them. But I mean, just looking at this map, there's a lot of them in north central New Mexico, so which is where a lot of acequias are, and then there's a lot in like the Gila area too. So
Yeah,
so
I suppose my other thought with that is the price of mutual domestics compared to, say, municipal supplies. Um, in places where water rights are more strictly regulated, so like acequias are a pretty strictly regulated place, and it's difficult to get water rights there compared to somewhere where you're allowed to just drill a new well and use that as your water supply. I wonder if that plays into the cost of it as well. Having that extra cost of buying and selling water rights and the uncertainty that's involved in that.
yeah, it seems, I mean, you would probably know more about this than me, but from my observation, I don't know, maybe AJ, you have input on this too, but it seemed that the communities that were mutual domestics had way more water rights than they needed. Whereas like cooperatives, they were the ones who didn't have as much water rights, and they're like newer communities, like suburbs. But it seems like some mutual domestics, they were using like, I don't know, 5 acre feet a year, and they had like 80 or something, like something crazy. So, and they were like really concerned about losing them, which I thought was interesting because I was like, you're using 5 and you have